This passage introduces a significant early conflict in the church. Should Gentile converts be required to follow Jewish laws, especially circumcision, to be saved? It sets the stage for the Council of Jerusalem, where church leaders discern the path forward. The early Christian community was grappling with its identity. Jesus was the Jewish Messiah, but Gentiles were entering the faith in large numbers. Some Jewish Christians believed that following the Mosaic law, including circumcision, was still necessary. This moment reflects a church at a crossroads. Is salvation rooted in the Old Covenant or the New Covenant in Christ? The church does not reject its roots, but sees the New Covenant in Christ as the fulfillment of the Old. Our identity is now formed through baptism, not circumcision as stated by St. Paul in his letter to the Colossians 2:11-12.
There are great disadvantages as well. Christendom is a time in which people can very easily become lukewarm. They can just be going around along for the ride. It can be a time of hypocrisy, pretending to care more about God and truth than you really do. It can be a time in which people will prey upon the church for material advantage because the church has influence, and so you can gain wealth or power by being associated with it, which compromises the purity of intention among priests and bishops. And all of those things are disadvantages. And also, there's an illusion. The devil is always on the move, and so the church is never weaker or more fragile or in greater danger than when it appears strong, but it's lost its rootedness in the invisible world. That's a time of great peril for the church. And so those are some disadvantages of Christendom. We live in a new apostolic age, though. The first apostolic age was the first 300 years, the age of the martyrs, and that the church operated according to a particular mode then, with different strategies than during Christendom. During the long time of Christendom, the church operated in a Christendom mode in Christendom, but in mission territory, the church always had that apostolic mode. Everybody knew that you didn't do things the same in Paris as in Papua New Guinea. And then, but then there are advantages and disadvantages to an apostolic age as well. In an apostolic age, because the cost to be a disciple is higher, there's much less hypocrisy. Hypocrisy is the sin of Christendom, not the sin of an apostolic time as much. The contours of the adventure that the gospel presents become clearer, and so the church begins to attract the most high-hearted, those who are seeking the greatest sacrifice, who are very high quality, not simply in their humanity, but in their spirit, which is very beautiful. There's a greater purity among priests and bishops because those who are there for the wrong reasons, because they're looking for power or influence or an easy life.
They won't find it in the church.
Yeah. So they'll find something better to do. Yeah. They'll get smart, and so that's all to the good, I think. And I think also you have the opportunity of suffering for the faith, which has always been seen as a great advantage.
Yeah, and so this is where you take up the famous quote from C.S. Lewis, where he had that correspondence with Don Calabria in Italy. There's a fascinating story behind that I think Don Calabria didn't speak English and C.S. Lewis didn't speak Italian, so they wrote to each other in Latin. And he takes up that idea that we're going back to talking to pagans, and he says no, we're not going back to talking to pagans. He says the difference between a pagan and an apostate, somebody who's left the faith, is the difference between an unmarried woman and an adulteress. So in a sense, living in a post-Christian world, the apostle has a kind of doubly difficult task because the people he's speaking to almost have been kind of vaccinated against the gospel because they think they know what it is.
Yeah, they think they've heard it and it has nothing to do with them. But that takes us right to the point, and this is the apex or the climax of that small essay, that our fundamental task in the world in which we live right now as disciples of Jesus is to reawaken the imaginative vision within the people all around us, within ourselves, first of all, to make sure that we're nourishing our minds and our hearts upon the epic drama of the gospel, and then that we're finding creative and amazing and effective ways to communicate that to people who think that they've heard it but really haven't, and so that they can hear it again for the first time. It's really important. But that happens. I've seen it happen. And when it happens, it's the most beautiful thing, because it's as though people are waking up from a nightmare. All of the promises that are made by the contemporary world, by this new religion, which has arisen in response to Christianity, it can't keep them. It begins with all of this high-minded, high-sounding promise. Throw off oppression. Let's say goodbye to the bad old days, the dark ages, all that we have to lose is our chains. But then it devolves into just boring, super boring materialism, shop till you drop. Yeah. And then nobody's satisfied with that. And I was saying to the priest today, I said, on the tube, on the underground ride over to Westminster, I was looking around to see if everybody in London, in this great secular city, is fabulously happy. You know what I mean? With all of the technological progress, we can get in big steel tubes and fly through the air, and we can have our food delivered to us by robots at the front door, and our lives are so comfortable and easy. We should be deliriously excited every day to enter into this wonderful life, and everybody is desperately sad. It's extraordinary. Yeah. It reminded me, I had a friend in seminary who had been a Carthusian for a year. He had discerned with the Carthusians. And they're serious business. You know what I mean? They're not sort of slacking. Silence and great asceticism all the time, all that. He was, after he discerned that he was not to remain there, the brothers gave him a bus ticket. He walked down the hill, he got on the bus, and he was struck to his bones with the impression that people were desperately sad. He hadn't seen that before, because, of course, that kind of sadness, there's plenty of struggle in the monastery, but that kind of sadness did not suffuse the atmosphere of the Carthusian monastery where he was, but it filled, and he said, I was haunted by it for weeks upon weeks, that the world is desperately sad. And so this is a great advantage to us. People are, on my campus, we're the Shire. It's a happy place. There's lots of wonderful spiritual activity happening all the time, confessions and adoration and masses and wonderful classes. And I hire great, not just faculty who are smart, but good looking. You know what I mean? It's a wonderful place. But we see what everybody's seeing, increasing amounts of mental health issues, depression, anxiety, inability to cope with life. What is that all about? Well, it's because the culture is poison, and Christianity is the antidote, and we want to get it into the hands of as many people as possible. And so our key task is to preach the gospel in a way that people can hear it again. And so that means that we have to lean into the epic arc of it, the profound imaginative force behind the story of the gospel, because we've got it. We have the best story.
In terms of experience, again, I'll come back to St. Augustine, someone who we as Augustinians certainly appreciate and know very well. But I would say that Augustine is one of the church fathers who very clearly spoke about experience. And one of the reasons that the Confessions continues to be one of the widest read books in the history of the world is precisely because of Augustine's insight into human experience.
Back in college, I took a class called World Religions. Actually, I took a number of these classes. It was really good because it's good to study what people have believed throughout history, what people believe throughout the world. And it's great to study the differences and know some of the similarities. One of the things I found, though, is that virtually all of these classes that I took, you get a textbook, and each chapter in the book would be divided up according to a different religion. So chapter 1 would be Buddhism, then Confucianism, then Christianity, then Islam, Judaism, Zoroastrianism, Taoism, whatever it is. And you'd go through the book and you'd study the different points of the different religions and look at their merits and look at their faults. The problem was that when you studied Christianity, they didn't appreciate the fact that Christianity is uniquely different than all other world religions. Here's what I mean. All world religions were founded by someone who either claimed to have insight into God or they claimed to have a revelation from God. But Christianity was founded by someone, Jesus Christ, who didn't claim to have insight into God or revelation from God. Jesus actually claimed to be God. And so when we study world religions, especially when we're looking for like what's true, like what actually is unique, what is the one that I can believe in? When it comes to Christianity, we don't have to just jump to like the minute details. We don't have to jump to the articles of the creed. All we have to do is answer this one question. Is Jesus who he says he is? Because he claims to be God, and if he's not, then all of Christianity is false. But if he is, then all of Christianity is going to be true. Now, I'll talk to people all the time who will say things like, well, I believe Jesus was a holy person, he was a prophet, but I don't believe that Jesus was God. C.S. Lewis, who is an author and who's talk about this a lot, he'd say, that's the one thing about Jesus that you can't say. You can't say that he was a holy person, but not God. Why? Because he actually claimed to be God. And if he wasn't God, then that means he was not a good person. He was either a liar, he wasn't God and he knew he wasn't God, or he was a lunatic. He wasn't God, but he didn't know he wasn't God. Or he actually is who he says he is. He is the Lord. That's called the trilemma. Jesus is either a liar, he's a lunatic, or he is the Lord. So let's look at this. First, maybe Jesus is a liar. Maybe he was lying. Now, interesting. If you ever study the personality profile of someone who's a compulsive liar, or even someone who does like basically lies for a living, someone who is a professional liar, and if you're going to pull off the lie that says you are the creator of the universe, that means you are incredibly committed to this lie. When you look at that personality profile, that psychological profile of someone who lies like that, they have certain traits. They are incredibly narcissistic. They're incredibly self-involved. They lack a certain compassion. They lack creativity. But when we study the life of Jesus, you see the exact opposite. You see someone who is incredibly creative. You see someone who is incredibly self-giving, someone who's completely compassionate and not self-involved. So Jesus at least doesn't fit the profile of a liar. So maybe he's a lunatic. Maybe he wasn't God, but he didn't know he wasn't God. Now this is, I think, fascinating because our degree of sanity, like all of us, our degree of sanity matches up with our degree of being conformed to reality or in touch with reality. Here's what I mean. If I were to say, I'm a priest, then my degree of sanity conforms to reality, right? So I am a priest. But if I were to say something like, I am the best priest in the world, then I would be slightly, actually largely disconnected from reality. And if you were talking with me for any amount of time, you'd quickly catch on to the fact that, okay, this priest is not connected to reality. But what if I were even further disconnected and I said, I'm the Pope, and I really believed that I was the Holy Father, but shh, don't tell anyone. Pretty quickly, you'd realize that I was not connected to reality. But if I was even further disconnected and I said, like, I am Marie Antoinette, and you can have cake, very, very quickly, you would catch on, okay, this guy is not connected to reality. And if I was so far gone, so far disconnected from reality, really believed that I was a butterfly, and I really am a butterfly. And you should have known, you should have been there when I was in that cocoon. It was crazy, really tight quarters. Like you would quickly catch on, this guy's not connected to reality. Now Jesus is unique because he doesn't just claim to be the greatest prophet of all time. He doesn't just claim to be Elijah come back from the dead. Jesus actually claims to be God, the maker of everything in the universe. And if he was disconnected from reality that way, if he wasn't really God, people all around him would very, very quickly catch on to the fact that he isn't who he says he is. And yet when you read the story, what you get is he actually is living, he is walking, he is talking, he's acting like he's connected to reality. So Jesus isn't a liar. He isn't a lunatic. That leaves only one option left. He actually is who he says he is, that he's the Lord. Now, that doesn't prove that he is who we need, in order for us to believe in Jesus, we need to have him prove it. So that's what he does. I mean, honestly, if someone walked into the room where you are right now and said, hello, everyone, I'm God, you wouldn't just say, okay. And back in the day, they didn't either. Sometimes we think that because they lived so long ago, they were simple, like they didn't know how to do stuff. They didn't know how to like program their TiVo. They didn't know how to use iPods. Therefore, they were just dumb. And if someone came on the scene and just claimed to be God, they would just completely believe him. But they didn't. In fact, when Jesus came on the scene and claimed to be God, they did what we do. They asked him to do what we would ask him to do. And what is that? They asked him to prove it. So that's what Jesus does. His whole life, in the last 3 years of his ministry, is him proving that he is who he says he is. In fact, the second chapter of Mark's gospel, there's this scene, you've probably heard of it, where there's the one paralyzed man and his 4 friends are carrying him on a stretcher to Jesus. But there's so many people in the house where Jesus is, they couldn't get through the door, so they go up on the roof and they do some remodeling, right? And they make a skylight and they lower the guy down in front of Jesus. And it says, Jesus looked at their faith, looked at the man, and he said, your sins are forgiven. And at that moment, everyone's like, whoa, 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 whoa. Who but God can forgive sins? And Jesus is like, I know, right? This guy. But he says, to prove to you that I am who I say I am. He says to the man, rise, pick up your mat, and walk. Jesus claimed to be God, and then he proves that he is who he says he is. In fact, that's why in St. John's Gospel, when he talks about miracles, he doesn't use the word miracles. He uses the term signs and wonders. What do signs do? Signs always point to something else. All of Jesus' miracles, all of his signs and wonders, those signs all point to the fact that Jesus is who he says he is. And the greatest miracle of Jesus' life is actually at his death. Because when he is crucified and when he is dead, what he ultimately does to prove that he is who he says he is, that he is the Lord of life, he's the one who can conquer death, he's the one who made everything, he rises from the dead. And this is remarkable because this sign, this wonder, is so wondrous that it absolutely takes all of the disciples and all the apostles by surprise. I mean, think about this. Throughout Jesus' life, doesn't he say that here's what's going to happen? We're going to Jerusalem. They're going to arrest me. They're going to torture me. They're going to kill me. I'm going to die. But don't worry, because after 3 days, I'm going to rise from the dead. Have you ever noticed that when it actually happens, all the apostles are like, what's going on? They're all freaking out. In fact, we know Jesus dies on a Friday. They lay him in the tomb. 3 days later, on Sunday morning, it says these women are going to the tomb, not because they say, oh, it's Sunday, he's alive again, because they're going to the tomb because they're like, we need to anoint his body for burial. They expect him to be dead. He's dead. They expected him to stay dead. And when they get to the tomb and the stones roll back, they're not like, oh yeah, that's right. They're like, what's going on? And they look in the tomb and the body's gone. They're not like, oh yeah, that's right. They're like, what's going on? In fact, they all leave, but Mary Magdalene stays behind in that garden outside the tomb, and she's weeping, not for joy because he's alive. She's weeping because she thinks someone stole his body. So much so that when she sees Jesus, she thinks he's a gardener. She says, if you've taken his body, take me to where you put him because I'll rebury him, basically. And this is Jesus she's talking to. I love the moment because Jesus basically looks at Mary. He says one word. He says her name. Like, Mary. Like, hello. And Mary realizes, this is Jesus. He is who he says he is. She said, Rabboni. So she runs. Mary runs in joy to the other apostles and tells them, Jesus rose from the dead. I saw him alive. And you think the apostles would be like, oh my gosh, was that today? We totally forgot. We spaced that. But they say, nope. Not doesn't happen. Only 2 of the apostles, think about, of the remaining 11, only 2 of the apostles run to the tomb to even check out her story, Peter and John. And when they get there, you'd think that they would say, oh yeah, but they're like, what's going on? In fact, an angel has to come to them and say, remember what he said. Just imagine this, like rubbing his temples, like he said he would have to die and rise from the dead. That's today. They return home amazed and bewildered. Later on that day, that same Sunday, the apostles are all together with the disciples and the doors are locked and Jesus appears to them. He says, this is my body, my flesh, my whole self risen from the dead. And they're amazed. Remember there was one apostle though who wasn't there? Thomas. I always picture Thomas like he was out on an errand, something getting groceries, and he like does the secret knock and they let him in. And they're like, Thomas, we saw Jesus, he's alive again. And he'd be like, oh man, I always miss out on everything. But Thomas, he doesn't say that. He doesn't say, oh, that's right. He says, nope, I'm not going to believe this. Remember, Thomas even actually goes so far as to say, unless I put my fingers in the nail marks and my hand in his side, I will not believe. So what happens? 1 week later, the next Sunday, they're all together in one place. And St. John makes the point of saying that this time Thomas was with them. And Jesus appears in the locked room. Imagine Thomas's face looking at Jesus. Oh no. But Jesus looks at Thomas and he says, Tommy, put her there. Thomas falls to his knees and he says 5 words, my Lord and my God. Because Jesus has just proven he is who he says he is. That he's not a liar, he's not a lunatic, he is the Lord. Jesus is who he says he is. He is God. And if Jesus is who he says he is, then that means you are who he says you are. So who is it that Jesus says you are?
It is precisely when one sits down and begins to reflect upon those ultimate questions that a choice is available to us. And I think that someone who, if you will, rationally and logically wants to embrace some kind of atheism, if we can call it that, if any true atheists do exist, that's a rather pessimistic and dark way to understand what life is about. And I think that the wisdom of the fathers, the wisdom of the church through centuries, the wisdom and the universal dimension of, if you will, religious experience shows that there is much more to life than that. And that, as a matter of fact, it isn't all dark. And that when one comes to discover this present history, that it is something which goes far beyond anything that the superficial world of spectacle can offer to us. And I think that the wisdom of the ages, if you will, along with the experience that we can indeed live, the peace, the true sense of happiness that those who do search for God in their lives, the happiness that they can find is indeed a gift that shows us what real truth is about, that shows us what real life is about, and gives us an understanding to what the meaning of life is.